And what happened next?
I started hearing yelling. Yelling come from the house, screaming. People saying, "Get out of my house. You're not welcome here."
Hi everyone, I'm Kevin, and this is Just Thought Lounge. JTL is the true crime channel that delivers serious, well-balanced coverage of the cases that really make you think. In this case, we're taking a look at the relationship between a father and son, the pair of men that left their home in Alvin, Texas on a road trip at Christmastime in 2014. They packed up their vehicle with camping gear and headed out for the road. However, they were not just camping. 1 week later, emergency services in the area of Oak Hill, North Carolina would respond to a house fire where the elderly homeowners, Jerome and Dora Faulkner, were nowhere to be found, their house left in ruins. But despite the damage, there were clues as to what had happened to the older couple. On New Year's Day 2015, the pieces of this bizarre and tragic puzzle began to come together when a vehicle with North Carolina plates was pulled over on the highway in West Virginia. There were some facts that seemed certain, but many questions remained. What really transpired in the home of Jerome and Dora Faulkner on New Year's Eve 2014? There's a lot to cover in this one, so let's take a look. The small town of Oxford, North Carolina had a population of about 8,400 residents in the winter of 2014. Tree-lined streets led out into the countryside where rural homeowners had larger properties and greater privacy. On one of these roads, Highway 96 in the area of Oak Hill, set back from the highway, was the home of Jerome and Dora Faulkner. 73-year-old Jerome had retired years earlier from the fire department. He had been a founding member of the Cornwall Volunteer Fire Department in the 1980s and had served as its chief. In more recent years, his health was beginning to fail. He and Dora remained popular around town and active in their church. Dora was only 62 years old and still working as a nurse. The couple had raised two sons, Ricky and Jerome Jr. New Year's Day 2015, smoke was billowing out across the dense tree line that separated the Faulkners' home from their closest neighbors. Police and firefighters arrived on scene to find the house engulfed in flames. There was not much of the house left to salvage when the smoke cleared. However, there were indications of what had occurred on the property. Investigators from the Granville County Sheriffs noticed what appeared to be blood visible on the back doorstep. They thought it was possible that the elderly couple had been taken forcefully from their home in the early morning hours. Jerome and Dora Faulkner were nowhere to be found. No one was located inside the house. The couple's red pickup truck was also missing. Around 4 p.m. the same day, over 200 miles northwest from the burnt-out house in Oak Hill, North Carolina, a white suburban Tahoe was driving westbound on Interstate 64, just outside of Lewisburg, West Virginia. When the Suburban crossed the state line from North Carolina to West Virginia earlier that day, its license plate was captured by a highway camera, and it was subsequently flagged as a stolen plate. A lady named Miriam Hogan had noticed the tags missing from her truck after a short trip to Walmart in Hillsborough a few days earlier. Lieutenant Jeremy Dove and Patrolman Nicholas Sams spotted the vehicle. Their cruiser's dash camera recorded what followed. Pulling over to the shoulder of the highway, the first observation that the lieutenant made was that the white SUV must be traveling with the red pickup truck that was in front of it. The truck pulled over and stopped on the shoulder of the highway just ahead of the Suburban, which appeared to follow it. The officers did not approach the vehicle. The back windows were almost entirely blocked by containers and piles of items. Police could not see clearly into the vehicle to determine if there was anyone else inside. For their own safety, Lieutenant Dove called the driver back towards him, and the two jointly walked behind the police cruiser where they could be heard discussing the stolen plates.
Come on here. Come on. Your license plate before it's stolen. I'm sorry? Your license plate before it's stolen.
Moments later, the driver of the red truck walks back towards the police car. Then, out of scope of the camera, the red truck driver pulls out a handgun and opens fire on the officers.
Did you ever have a plate calling and report it?
Both men are wearing protective vests. They are both hit. Lieutenant Dove was grazed in the back of his neck, while Patrolman Sams suffered shrapnel in his forehead. Dove responded quickly, however, and returned fire, hitting the gunman once in the leg. The gunman nonetheless managed to run off towards the nearby woods. He would not get very far. The driver of the Suburban, having immediately ran towards the red truck when the firing began, had succeeded in reaching it and had driven off. Backup law enforcement, including West Virginia state troopers, were called out, and the highway was shut down. About 90 minutes later, the rear lights to the red pickup truck were spotted by law enforcement in amongst the woodland only a few miles down the highway from where the shooting had occurred. The mountainous West Virginia landscape meant that the drop from the highway was a ravine, down which the truck had appeared to descend and crash with some force. The driver was not with the vehicle and had in fact wandered off into the woodland for a time. He had then passed some time hiding behind an interstate guardrail. Eventually, however, he gave up these efforts, walked out, and surrendered himself to law enforcement without further incident. The young driver was identified as 21-year-old Eric Campbell of Alvin, Texas, a small town just outside of Houston. He had been traveling with his father, 54-year-old Edward Campbell, since leaving Texas in the stolen Suburban on Christmas Eve. They swapped out plates in North Carolina, and after a few days near Hillsborough, they left for West Virginia. Their multi-state road trip came to an end a week later on Interstate 64 when Edward took out his handgun and began shooting. The incident on the highway was investigated in two parts. Crime scene number one was the area surrounding the white Suburban where the officers had been shot. Here, the team was assessing the considerable amount of items packed into the vehicle. Large totes full of items as though the Campbells were moving or as though they had just cleaned out a house. Crime scene number two surrounded the second vehicle, the red truck. Here, Sergeant Vance approached and lifted a large tarp covering the bed of the pickup truck and found a mattress underneath. Lifting this mattress, the sergeant discovered the bodies of two people. These individuals would later be identified as Jerome and Dora Faulkner. Two medical examiners were employed to conduct autopsies on the older couple. Both reached the same conclusion. This had been a brutal attack inflicting numerous injuries from a variety of weapons. Defensive wounds indicated that both Jerome and Dora had put up a fight and that neither of them had passed quickly. There was evidence that a spear, a plastic bag, a .22 caliber gun, a crossbow, and some kind of corrosive chemical had all been employed in the attack. Along with the bulk of items found in the Suburban, police found a handheld pump sprayer, one that could be, in theory, used to spray harsh chemicals. Personal belongings in the form of jewelry, banking information, and other financial paperwork, letters, as well as change purses owned by the Faulkners were found scattered in the woods around where the truck had crashed. As the sun rose that morning, investigators uncovered more areas where items had been buried under the dirt and leaves, some even placed in the nook of trees, seemingly in a failed attempt at concealing them. A receipt to an auto shop located in Georgia and others from shops along the Campbells' route provided further links between the father and son's trip up from Texas and the horrific scene at the Faulkners' Oak Hill home. The gun used to shoot Jerome Faulkner was also located. So was a collapsible spear, a weapon that matched injuries sustained by Dora. Eric Campbell and his older brother Nick had been raised to obey their father. By all accounts, Edward was a dominating and at times a violent man. He was also the singular, consistent, and constant adult presence in young Eric's life. By the age of 7, Eric's mother Valerie had grown extremely ill, required constant care, and was bedridden. During this time, his father, Edward, a nurse by profession, began a relationship with a woman that Eric would come to call Mum. Her name was Linda Lamotte. But in what would become a pattern in the Campbell household, Linda would not stay. Fearing for her own safety, she ended her relationship with Edward after only a few years and escaped the situation. A few years later, when Eric was 12 years old, Edward married again, this time to another nurse, a woman named Holly Smook. Together they had 3 more children whom Eric adored and helped to care for. But things were not all well at home. Ed was arrested for drug use in 2006 and then lost his job as a nurse the following year. His behavior became extremely erratic and the man became paranoid. Ed managed to sustain his drug habit by cooking his own meth, a process that he drew both of his sons into as well. In early December 2014, Ed was released on bond after his arrest for a brutal assault on his wife, Holly. In his fits of delusions and drug abuse, Ed had come to believe that Holly was having an affair with an old friend and ex-coworker of hers. Investigators in the Faulkner's murder believed that tracking down this man in North Carolina was the reason for Ed Campbell's impromptu road trip later that month. While on the road near to dusk on the 31st of December, Ed spotted Jerome Faulkner out at his mailbox. He identified the man as an easy target. According to Eric, the two then entered the wooded area towards the back of the Faulkner's property. The Faulkners had been selected as the victims of this brutal crime more or less at random. Both Ed and Eric made a series of statements to the police following their arrests. Amongst them was Ed's unequivocal insistence that his son Eric was not involved in the murders. He said, "That boy didn't have anything to do with this North Carolina stuff. I'm going in for it. You aren't going to find any prints from him anywhere around there." Edward Campbell told police, "Up in there in what you call it, West Virginia, they beat the crap out of him, and he probably said whatever they wanted him to say." He had some suspicions, Ed said of his son Eric, "but I am an authoritarian dad and he is not going to question me. He was trying to get me to go back to Texas." A spokesperson for West Virginia law enforcement stated that they did not know how Eric received the bruising across his face shown in his mugshot, but that he had just crashed a truck into a ravine. Ed's statements would seem at face value to exonerate his son from any wrongdoing. Indeed, Eric insisted that he believed his father's only intention was to rob the Faulkners, not to hurt them, and he remained obedient to his father out of fear alone. As the two both faced indictments for 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as arson, burglary, and other crimes related to the attack on the Faulkners, Edward Campbell waited in custody at Central Prison in Raleigh. Ed would not see the inside of the courtroom, however. In mid-March of that year, state prison officials found him hanged and unresponsive in his cell. Edward's suicide left Eric to stand trial on his own. And in a significant setback to Eric's defense, his father's earlier statements proclaiming Eric's innocence were deemed inadmissible. Ed had every reason to lie to try to save his son, the judge had ruled. The trial commenced in the summer of 2017. The state prosecution argued that both men had taken part equally in the crime. Eric, now 23 years old, argued that his father had acted alone. If found guilty of the first-degree murder charges, Eric faced a potential death sentence.
We believe the evidence will show that the path that led to this was filled with deliberate decisions and conscious choices of this defendant and his father. Deliberate decisions and conscious choices.
Eric's mother, Valerie, when he was 4 years old, suffered a brain injury, again under mysterious circumstances, and Eric and his older brother Nick were left in the sole care of their father. And growing up in the home of Ed Campbell was a scary place. And he tells Eric to gather some supplies to go camping. And among the things he tells him to bring are bows and a crossbow and a spear. And none of these things seem that odd to Eric. They've gone camping before. They've had those kind of things for hunting and other reasons. And at some point, Ed Campbell runs out of money. Eric still has some money, and he still has access to money. He's got grant money coming in and other things. But Ed Campbell's out of money, and he starts talking about it. Now, Ed Campbell, you got to understand, just talks and talks and talks. But one of the things that Ed Campbell starts talking about is how he's going to get money. And his dad always has schemes. Many of them are pretty horrible.
In the days before the murders, the Campbells made a couple of stops for supplies, and their shopping list was curious. On December 28th, the two entered a Home Depot homeware store in South Carolina. There they were captured on camera, at 3 separate angles, purchasing items that could have been used to make drugs, as Eric believed was the case, or could have been employed in a potential attack. At the home store, they purchased drain cleaner, lye being the key ingredient in the cleaner, 2 hand pump sprayer containers, which would hold the liquid chemicals, chains, padlocks, U-bolts, and muriatic acid. At a second stop, the 2 obtained sets of goggles and gloves, items that could be used to protect themselves from the harsh chemicals they intended to use or spray. During the same period, witnesses along Highway 96 in Oak Hill reported seeing a white Suburban driving slowly along the road, as though lost perhaps, near to the Faulkners' property. Prosecutors argued that these elements all led to one logical conclusion. The Campbells had purchased supplies in advance for the attack and scoped out the house. This was an intentional, planned, and premeditated attack. There was simply no way that Eric Campbell could have been unaware of what was about to occur. Indeed, with so many key items purchased in pairs, there was no way that he was not an equal partner in the crime. The prosecution showed footage of a local Walmart around midnight on the night of the attack at the Faulkners. By this time, the house had been broken into and the Faulkners were likely already dead. Footage showed Eric driving his father to the door. He waits in the parking lot while his father runs in just before store closing and purchases large storage totes, the same ones that will later be found full of the Faulkners' belongings in the back of the white Suburban. Eric waited in the SUV for his father to return. The 2 then returned to the property in Oak Hill together and cleaned out the house, packed up the Faulkners and their belongings. Eric took the stand to explain what he said really happened and his justification for the items purchased. They planned on having a camping trip, he said, and needed supplies to live off the land. He admits that he suspected that his father had ulterior motives for the chemicals, goggles, and gloves, but nothing violent.
Yeah. Do you remember, did you go to that Kannapolis
Yes, sir.
Walmart? Do you remember your dad buying those things?
Yes, sir.
And what did you think when he was buying those items?
It's items that we've always used for shaking and baking.
Well, when you were at either the Walmart or the Home Depot, do you remember going to a sporting goods store?
Yes, we did.
And I know there hasn't been any evidence about that, any videos or anything, but what did your dad purchase at the sporting goods store?
Now, we looked at warm clothes and also more bolts and arrows for when you go hunting, you lose them when you miss.
And did your dad tell you any reason why he wanted those bolts and arrows?
You live on the land, you need something to hunt and eat with.
Eric testified that he felt that he had no choice but to do as his father instructed. He did not take part in the murders. In fact, Eric claimed to have witnessed only portions of the attack. During most of the brutality, he was outside or distracted and in another area of the house. He remained unsure of what would happen as his father approached the Faulkners' front doorway at dusk on New Year's Eve.
Who's he?
My dad rang the doorbell.
And what happened after your dad rang the doorbell?
He waited. There was a man that answered the door. And I remember my dad saying that, our truck is broken down. If I could use your phone.
And what did you think when you heard your dad say that?
We didn't have any phones to begin with. I believe that, maybe he truly just wanted to call somebody to see if anybody was there first.
And then what happened?
He walked right in.
And he being, is that your father, walked right in?
Yeah.
And what happened next?
I started hearing yelling. Yelling come from the house, screaming. People saying, "Get out of my house. You're not welcome here." Yeah. I don't know.
Only when his father joined him in the Faulkners' office, where they searched for financial documents and other papers, did Eric learn of everything that had transpired during the attack.
Now, after that, where did you go? Where did your father go?
Back inside, he lit lanterns, and he took me back to the office.
And what did you do in the office?
Same thing I'd been doing.
And that was looking for the financial documents or documents relating to them? Did you want any of those documents?
No.
And why did you do that? I mean, did your dad tell you to do that, or did you just go do that on your own?
He told me to do it.
It's notable that during his recollection of these events to police, Eric provided many details pertaining to the act and spoke entirely in the first person, as though he was there to witness them. When on the stand, however, Eric insisted this was not the case. He knew facts and details only as they had been relayed to him by his father.
Did he stab the guy with the spear that you had in your bag?
He said that he stabbed him, yes.
Well, did you see it?
I didn't see him stab him.
But you had the spear in your bag.
Yes, sir, I did.
So how did he get the spear out of your bag to stab them if you didn't see it?
He had jerked the bag off me and told me to go in the living room.
But you were outside, remember?
He pulled me inside.
But you were outside for 5 minutes or more. Is that what you said?
I don't know how long I was outside.
When you put that bag on your shoulder, the shoulder strap was not like this, was it?
No, sir. It was just a normal bag.
All right, it was a normal bag with a black strap, right? And it did not have the bleaching from the lye, did it? Because that's what this is, isn't it?
Yes, sir, that is.
It is. And it's got that right there because you wore it into the house that way, right?
My dad took it from me, sir. I don't know how I got lye on it from him.
Key to explaining how Eric could have been coerced into taking part in this horrific crime yet bear no responsibility was his mental state. Dr. Ayesha Chowdhury, a forensic psychologist, testified over a few days that Eric was under the control of his father. She assessed that he suffered from post-traumatic stress from the events. She testified that Eric had been so controlled by his father that he was afraid to contact authorities or do anything that would have prevented the murders. She was stunned by the amount of time that Family Protective Services in Texas had investigated the Campbell family, stating that there were over 1,000 pages of material to review in relation to his treatment. Eric had told the doctor that he believed he was helping to protect both his father and his family members, including his stepmother Holly, by agreeing to the road trip with his father and by staying by his side. In rebuttal, the state called Dr. Nicole Wolf, who reviewed the available footage of the pair and noted that Eric did not appear to be demonstrating the behaviors one would associate with a traumatic state. He did not appear paralyzed with fear of his father.
Well, somebody can be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, any day, but even if they have post-traumatic stress disorder, it doesn't stop them from going through a list and putting these items in a cart. And having some awareness of each of these items' functions. And again, the behavior is quite unremarkable. There's attention to what's being placed in the basket, and later at the cash register, he has a very casual demeanor.
Is this consistent with someone who is in a dissociative episode?
No, it is not.
Someone who is exhibiting the symptoms of hypervigilance?
No.
Frozen with fear?
No.
They also have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that even if Eric knew or had some inkling that that was what was going to happen, that he joined in that common purpose, that he shared it, that that was his purpose, that he wanted those things to happen. And they can't prove that. They can't prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. And if they can't prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, then Eric cannot be held liable for any of the things his father did. He can only be held liable for things that he did.
The defense wants you to think that Ed did this all by himself. A pair of gloves that were found in the truck. These. The pair of gloves that you found, they said, in the console of the truck. State's Exhibit 504. And then the next thing that you saw, or the first piece of evidence that we introduced from the Suburban, were the same gloves. The same type of gloves. Taken off, discarded into the floorboard of the Suburban. We know who was driving the Suburban. We saw it on the video. We know who was driving the truck. We saw that on the video. There's two of everything in this bag. The same bag the defendant says that he was carrying. The only thing that he says he was carrying, because there wasn't necessarily a weapon in it. But we found electrical tape on the inside of this. Tape up the shoes so you don't get the chemical spray up into your legs. Taping up your jeans and your shoes for an attack is premeditation and deliberation. First-degree murder.
The jury was given instructions for their deliberations after weeks of witness testimony. But then, after just 2.5 hours, attorneys on both sides were called back into the courtroom. The judge had some news. Juror number 3 had passed a note to the judge stating that they felt they were not capable of making this decision. Deliberations had already commenced, and alternative juror was not an option. The judge asked counsel how they would like to proceed.
My understanding would be that would cause a mistrial. I don't know what that means. If she can't evaluate the case, and that means if she withdraws from the deliberation, that means 11 jurors are deciding the case. I mean, it makes me uncomfortable both ways, I guess. I don't really know what to say.
Ultimately, the jury was recessed early for a long weekend. The hope was that every juror would be happy to proceed following the break. However, over the course of the weekend, the same juror, number 3, was involved in a relatively serious traffic accident. Deliberations were placed on hold for 3 weeks while the juror had necessary surgery and time to recuperate. In the end, the verdict was returned by the original 12 jurors unanimously. Eric Campbell was found guilty of first-degree murder, first-degree burglary, robbery with a dangerous weapon, second-degree arson, and 2 counts of animal cruelty.
So he's struggling with the verdict, but he's keeping his head up because he has the confidence of someone who knows he's innocent. Eric had trouble being in the courtroom. This was all very stressful for him, but he was always a very genuine person. He always struck me as someone who was honest, and I always believed him that he was innocent.
Eric was spared death row. He was given life in prison. Jerome and Dora's 2 sons, who had successfully avoided the media throughout the ordeal, expressed their relief in the verdict and sentencing, as well as their appreciation for the work of the many law enforcement entities involved in their parents' case. Eric Campbell appealed his conviction on the basis that juror number 3's lack of confidence in the deliberations should have immediately sparked a mistrial. This initial appeal failed. That was the messy case of the Campbells and the tragic story of Jerome and Dora Faulkner. Thank you for joining me. I'm Kevin. This is Just Thought Lounge, and I'll see you in the next one.